You might have seen a lot of American whiskeys on my timeline, especially when I'm making cocktails. So I thought I'd do a quick primer on American whiskeys. And the idea here is to not really go rule by rule, point by point, or what makes a whiskey a bourbon or a Tennessee or a rye, but an overview of these whiskeys and how they're different from Indian whiskeys, single malts, Irish whiskeys, for that matter. And for any whiskey in the world, wherever it's made, its flavor is determined by two main factors. One is what was the whiskey made out of, and how was it aged. So I'm going to introduce a new word here called mash bill. And a mash bill is basically the recipe of a whiskey. It's the proportion of the grains in it. Now, Scottish whiskies are predominantly made with malted barley, Scottish single malts, that is, and American whiskies, especially if I talk about bourbons, are predominantly made with corn. So if you look at a bourbon, it'll be 51% corn at least in the mash bill. If it's a rye whiskey like this Bullet or Sazerac, it'll be at least 51% rye. So that's the first very simple difference. Now, within bourbons, you have, let's say, a Buffalo Trace and a Maker's Mark. Both will at least be 51% corn because they're both bourbons. But a Buffalo Trace does not have any wheat in it. It's corn, malted barley, and rye, whereas a Maker's Mark has no rye in it. So it's corn predominantly, more than 51%, and it's wheat and malted barley. So even though they're both bourbons, they overall might have a similar sort of a profile in terms of a whiskey, but they do taste very different because the recipes are very different. So with this mash bill situation and more corn or more rye, for me, and taste is very subjective, American whiskeys taste a little sweeter. If it's bourbon, if it's rye, it tastes a little more spicy. But they seem a little rougher on the edge. For me, that's personally very enjoyable because for for me, I could have these whiskeys as it is in a glass, but they're great for cocktails. And right from a whiskey sour to an old fashioned to a Sazerac, they just really become their own with cocktails because they do have that little roughness that comes from the barrel aging as well, a lot of vanilla that comes from the barrel aging. And that's actually the second most important factor, how a whiskey is aged. Now, if you're a bourbon, you have to be aged in new barrels. So you cannot take a used barrel or you cannot use a barrel twice. In fact, most whiskeys here would be only aged in new barrels. So most American producers will age their whiskey in new oak. They take oak barrels, they light a fire inside it, they char it. Essentially, that's basically caramelizing the sugars in the wood, and that's what ages your whiskey. And once these barrels are used, they're shipped all over the world. In fact, Paul John just got a massive number of barrels from Sazerac. Should follow them on Instagram. They just put up video pictures a few days back. So these barrels are shipped all over the world. In fact, a lot of single malts, not a lot, most single malts today are aged in barrels that were first used to age bourbons or American whiskeys. So these are two very distinct factors that really make American whiskeys what they are. Uh, I would suggest if you're starting off, a good collection to have would be Buffalo Trace, Maker's Mark, Sazerac, and perhaps a Jim Beam. You get the regular Jim Beam white and you get the black in India. These unfortunately are not available in India. I really wish Bullet makes its way here soon, both the regular Bullet and the Bullet Rye. And for me personally, American whiskeys are just fantastic, like I said, to drink by themselves or to make cocktails. When it comes to tasting American whiskeys, if you have a fancy Glencairn glass, keep it away. Get a nice whiskey glass. For me, my current favorite is this really thin Borosil glass, easily available on Amazon. And don't add anything to it. And we're just tasting right now. We're not really drinking this, but just get the whiskey as it is. No teaspoon of water, no ice, nothing. Take the whiskey, a little bit of it, make this chewing sort of a sound, action. The term's called Kentucky Chew, and if Mila Kunis can do it, so can you. The idea here is that the whiskey goes all over your mouth. There's air that goes into your mouth as well, and you just end up enjoying the whiskey a lot more. Opens up a lot of flavors. So yeah, that's it from me. Let me know if there are any of these whiskeys that you really like or don't dislike, really like or don't like. And if that's the case, you should actually Google the mash bill of that whiskey. So, for example, if it's Bullet Rye, if you just Google Bullet Rye mash bill, there are enough websites on the internet now that'll actually give you the exact recipe, the breakdown of the grains. And that's a great way to understand the kind of whiskeys you like or don't like, because going back to Maker's Mark, there are diehard fans of Maker's Mark, and a lot of that comes down to because this has no rye in it, and a lot of people prefer that, versus a lot of people prefer bourbons with rye in it. So if you look up the mash bill of a whiskey, it can actually even give you a fair idea of the kind of whiskeys you might like more or less, depending on what grains go in it. So cheers, and next time perhaps we'll talk about cocktails with these whiskeys.